He built rifles that could fire faster than France's own army could reload. He also built an army that ran on captives. This is the story of Samori Touré, and it is not a story where the pride comes first and the cost comes after. They were the same system from the very first year. He was born around 1830 in what is now Guinea, into a family of Dioula traders, merchants who moved kola nuts and cloth along trade routes, not warriors. Then, in the early 1850s, raiders from the Cissé clan struck his hometown of Sanankoro. They took his mother. She was carried off to the Cissé stronghold at Medina, and the young trader made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He walked into the service of the men who had taken her, not as a prisoner, but as a soldier, because that was the only door that led back to her. Oral tradition says he served the Cissé for 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days before she was finally freed. The exact count is legend. The years he spent learning to fight inside another clan's army were not. He never put down the sword he picked up to get her back. By the 1870s, that soldier had become something else entirely. A builder of states. Most regional warlords of that era did what warlords had always done: raid a territory, take what could be carried, and move on. Samori did something different. Across the upper Niger region, he consolidated one of the most disciplined territories West Africa had seen in generations. And then he stayed. He established his capital at Bissandougou and built the machinery that separates a raiding party from an empire. Provincial governors answering to a central authority. A functioning tax and tribute system. Courts that could settle disputes without his personal presence required. In 1884, he took the title Al-Mahmi Imam, claiming religious as well as political authority, and began building Quranic schools and Islamic courts across his territory. The reform reached different corners of his empire unevenly, and in places was resisted, sometimes by force. But it was still a transformation raiding parties never attempt. An effort to build something meant to outlive any single military campaign. This placed him in the same company as the Mali and Songhai empires this channel has already told you about. A builder in a long West African tradition of building. One that colonial histories would later erase almost entirely. But Samori built one thing those empires never had to. An arms industry designed specifically to outlast a European invasion. Picture the workshop first, not a battlefield, a workbench. A captured French rifle, taken apart piece by Samori's own gunsmiths, who had no factory, no formal training from Europe, no supply chain crossing the Mediterranean. Just the weapon in front of them, and the will to understand it. They studied the mechanism. They rebuilt it. By the 1880s, those workshops were producing functioning repeating rifles on Samori's own soil. Weapons that French colonial officers, encountering them in the field, described with something closer to alarm than dismissal. In specific respects, the guns coming out of Samori's territory matched or outperformed the standard-issue rifles French infantry carried into West Africa. This was not a legend inflated after his death. It is in their own field reports. The soldiers who carried those rifles into battle were called the Sofa, Samori's professional fighting force, the backbone of everything he built. And the Sofa, in large part, were enslaved. Here is the system, stated plainly. Samori's campaigns produced captives. Captives were sold for horses, for foodstuffs, for the raw materials that kept the gunsmiths working. The revenue from that trade bought and built the next generation of weapons. Those weapons armed the next campaign, and the next campaign produced the next wave of captives. Historians studying his war economy estimate tens of thousands of people were sold through this system over the course of his reign. The rifles that make this story remarkable and the captive economy that makes this story uncomfortable were never two separate stories. They were one machine, and it ran continuously for 16 years. France wanted the interior of West Africa, and France assumed it would take it the way it had taken everything else, with superior artillery and the presumption that no African army could sustain a real war against a European one.
Samori's answer to that presumption was not a single great battle.
It was a tactic French commanders came to dread more than any battlefield defeat. When their columns pushed into Wassoulou territory with artillery, and numbers Samori's forces couldn't match head-on, he didn't just retreat his army. He erased the ground behind him. Fields burned, granaries emptied or destroyed, entire towns dismantled. Their people marched east under his own orders, so that when French forces finally stood on the land they'd fought for, there was nothing there. No crops to seize, no population to tax, no economy to inherit. Just ash and abandoned earth. He did this again and again, at a scale that meant relocating, in effect, an entire functioning state. Its people, its administration, its war economy. Hundreds of miles across the map, faster than France could redraw its own advance. By the 1890s, that retreat had carried
Samori's empire
out of French Guinea's reach entirely, and into what is now eastern Côte d'Ivoire, where he rebuilt his capital near Decolonize. The captive trade that had financed him from the beginning followed him there too. The market at Kotia-Kofikro, near his new base, became a documented center of that same economy, operating up until the final months before everything ended. At dawn on September 29, 1898, a French column of roughly 200 soldiers under Captain Henri Gouraud moved into Samori's camp at Guélémou, in the forests of what is now western Côte d'Ivoire. No battle happened. Not one shot was fired. 16 years of resistance that French artillery couldn't break, that French treaties couldn't buy, that French rifles couldn't outgun in the field, ended in a single silent morning, because a column of soldiers simply walked in before anyone could reach for a weapon. Roughly 1,800 Sofa, what remained of the army that had held off an empire for a generation, laid down their arms without a fight. He was exiled to Gabon, as far from Wassoulou as France could send him. He died there in 1900. He never went home.
We built weapons no one gave us, and we built an empire that ran, in part, on the very system of captivity we were fighting colonization to resist. Both of those things are Samori Touré's legacy. History does not require us to choose only one.